I pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Yellowstone Ranger Station with my windows down, breathing in the crisp mountain air that carried hints of pine and distant sulfur from the hot springs. After 2 years of pushing papers at a desk job in Denver, this felt like coming back to life. The building ahead looked exactly like I'd imagined. Rustic logs with green trim, American flags snapping in the breeze, everything screaming authentic wilderness experience. My hands drummed against the steering wheel as I gathered my paperwork from the passenger seat. HR had been weird during the final interview, going on about unique challenges and unconventional protocols, but I'd chalked it up to government bureaucracy. Every job had its quirks, and I'd dealt with plenty of red tape before. The wooden steps creaked under my boots as I climbed to the main entrance. Inside, the station felt like stepping back in time. Wood paneling, vintage Park Service posters, and the musty smell of old paperwork mixed with coffee. A man came out from an office in the back, and I knew immediately this had to be Robert Hayes. He looked like he'd been carved from the same material as the mountains themselves. Deep lines mapped his face like hiking trails, and his salt and pepper hair was cropped military short. His ranger uniform looked pressed but worn, like he'd been wearing versions of it for decades. When his blue eyes met mine, I felt like he was taking inventory of my soul. Patterson. He extended a weathered hand. Robert Hayes, you're right on time. Yes, sir. Looking forward to getting started. I matched his firm handshake and tried to project confidence. We'll see about that. He turned back toward his office, motioning for me to follow. Got some paperwork to go over first? His office was sparse. Metal desk, 2 filing cabinets, and a few framed photos of rangers from decades past. Robert settled behind his desk and pulled out a manila folder, but instead of the usual employment forms, he withdrew a single sheet of handwritten paper. Before we cover the standard procedures, you need to understand these. He slid the paper across the desk. I picked it up, expecting maybe a checklist of daily tasks or emergency contacts. Instead, I found 6 rules written in careful block letters. 1. Close the main gate before sunset. No exceptions. 2. Never enter the woods after dark. 3. If you hear voices calling for help at night, do not investigate. 4. Stay on designated paths at all times. 5. Avoid any lights you see in the forest. 6. Do not investigate sounds of crying, especially children. I read through the list twice, waiting for some kind of explanation or context. When I looked up, Robert was watching me with an expression that made my stomach clench. These seem... I struggled for the right word. Unusual for basic safety protocols. They're not suggestions, Patterson. Previous rangers who decided to interpret these rules creatively didn't work out. The way he said, "didn't work out," made it sound like something worse than getting fired. I looked at the list again, seeing how specific some of the rules were. Who writes down, "Do not investigate sounds of crying children unless something specific happened"? Can you give me some background on why these particular... No. Robert's tone cut through my question like a blade. Follow them exactly as written. That's all you need to know. I folded the paper and slipped it into my shirt pocket, fighting the urge to ask more questions. This wasn't how I'd imagined my orientation going, but Robert's body language made it clear the topic was closed. Let's cover your daily responsibilities. He pulled out a proper manual this time. You'll be checking permits at the main entrance, maintaining trail markers, and doing basic visitor assistance during daylight hours. The next few hours passed in a blur of normal ranger duties, learning the permit system, radio protocols, basic maintenance procedures. Robert showed me around the station, introduced me to the equipment storage, and walked me through the daily log requirements. Everything felt reassuringly ordinary after the bizarre rule list. We spent the afternoon hiking some of the main trails so I could get familiar with the layout. Robert pointed out trail markers that needed replacement, explained the visitor patterns, and showed me the boundaries I'd be responsible for maintaining. The work itself was exactly what I'd signed up for: outdoor problem solving with plenty of physical activity. The park was beautiful in the late afternoon light. Massive evergreens stretched up towards snow-capped peaks, and the air carried that clean, thin quality you only get at high altitude. Tourists moved along the paths in small groups, snapping photos and chattering excitedly about wildlife sightings. It felt like the kind of place where the biggest challenges would be lost hikers and overeager photographers getting too close to buffalo. We headed back as the light started to fade, and Robert checked his watch more frequently than seemed necessary. When we reached the station, he immediately looked toward the main gate. "Gate needs to be closed in 15 minutes, he said, his voice carrying an urgency that hadn't been there earlier. "I'll take care of it," I replied, pulling the rule list from my pocket to double-check the wording. "Good. And Patterson?" Robert's hand landed on my shoulder, his grip firm. "Don't forget. Ever." He walked back into the station without another word, leaving me standing in the parking lot with the list in my hands. I walked over to the main gate and started the closing procedure Robert had shown me earlier. Chain and padlock, double-check the latches, test the lock. Simple enough, though I couldn't understand why sunset was such a hard deadline. Parks had closing times, sure, but the emphasis Robert placed on this particular rule felt different. By the time I finished, the sun had dropped behind the mountains, leaving the forest in deep twilight. I headed back to the station, where Robert was gathering his things. "I'll be heading out," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You're on night duty. Radio's programmed with emergency channels, but standard procedure is to stay inside after dark unless there's a genuine emergency." "Define genuine emergency." "Medical situations, fires, people in immediate physical danger." He paused at the door. "Not voices, not lights, not crying. Remember that." The door closed behind him with a definitive click, and I heard his truck start up outside. Within minutes, the engine noise faded into the distance, leaving me alone in the station. I made myself a cup of coffee and settled at the main desk, spreading out the paperwork Robert had given me. The building felt different with no one else around. Every small sound seemed amplified, and the walls creaked in ways I hadn't noticed during the day. I kept glancing toward the windows, though all I could see was my own reflection against the darkness outside. The rule list sat next to my coffee mug, and I found myself reading through it again. Each rule raised more questions than it answered. Why specify "especially children" for the crying sounds? What kind of lights would someone see in a forest that would need to be avoided? And why did Robert look like he was speaking from personal experience when he warned me about the consequences? I pulled out my phone to check if I had cell service, thinking I might call my buddy Jake to tell him about the weird first day. No bars. Of course. I was officially cut off from the outside world, alone in a ranger station with a list of rules that read like something from a horror movie. The coffee helped settle my nerves, and I tried to focus on the administrative tasks Robert had outlined. Inventory sheets, daily logs, equipment checks. Normal stuff that reminded me this was just a job, even if it came with some unconventional guidelines. But I couldn't shake the feeling that those 6 rules existed for a reason. And whatever that reason was, I probably didn't want to find out firsthand. The clock on the wall ticked past 9, and I realized I'd been staring at the rule list for the better part of an hour. I folded it carefully and tucked it back into my shirt pocket, right over my chest. I'd been staring at the same inventory spreadsheet for what felt like hours, cross-referencing equipment serial numbers with maintenance logs. 3 days into this job, and I was already drowning in the administrative side of things. My coffee had gone cold sometime around 7, but I kept sipping it anyway, trying to stay focused on the endless columns of numbers that Robert needed reconciled by morning. The paperwork was more complex than I'd expected. Every piece of equipment had to be tracked, logged, and accounted for with military precision. Radios, flashlights, first aid supplies, trail maintenance tools, everything had forms in triplicate. I'd been a decent student, but this level of detail made my old desk job look simple. My pen scratched against the paper as I corrected another discrepancy between the supply count and the log entries. The silence in the station felt heavier tonight, maybe because I was actually concentrating instead of jumping at every small sound like I had on my first shift. The building's familiar creaks and settling noises had become background white noise. It wasn't until I glanced at the wall clock that my stomach dropped straight through the floor. 8:37 p.m. The gate. I'd completely forgotten about the gate. I shot up from the desk so fast my chair rolled backward and hit the filing cabinet. The rule list crinkled in my shirt pocket as I grabbed my flashlight from the equipment rack. My hands shook slightly as I checked the beam. Still strong, thank God. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I could smell the dampness that always seemed to hang around the forest after dark. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked quickly toward the main entrance, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead of me. Robert's words repeated in my head. No exceptions. I'd broken the first and most basic rule on my fourth day. Whatever consequences he'd hinted at for previous rangers who didn't work out, I was about to find out firsthand. The gate came into view about 50 yards ahead, still wide open like an invitation to whatever lived in these woods after sunset. I picked up my pace, eager to get this over with and get back inside where things made sense. That's when I saw him. A figure stood near the entrance, just to the left of the gate posts. Middle-aged guy in what looked like street clothes, jeans and a jacket that seemed too thin for the mountain air. He was moving in small, jerky steps like he couldn't decide which direction to go. I approached cautiously, raising my flashlight but not aiming it directly at him yet. "Sir, park's closed for the night." The man turned toward me, and even from 20 feet away I could see something was off about the way he moved. His head tilted too far to one side, and his arms hung at strange angles like a puppet with tangled strings. "Lost," he said, his voice carrying an odd rhythm that didn't match normal speech patterns. "Need to find them. They're waiting." "Who's waiting, sir?" I stepped closer, professional training kicking in despite the weird feeling crawling up my spine. "Are you separated from your group?" He took a few steps toward me, and I could see his movements were all wrong. Each step looked disconnected from the last, like he was learning how to walk as he went. His shoulders jerked with each movement, and his head kept tilting at weird angles. "Them," he repeated, louder this time. They said to wait, but waiting hurts." I was close enough now to see his face pale and drawn with deep shadows under his eyes. Something about his expression reminded me of people I'd seen in emergency rooms, that blank, thousand-yard stare that meant someone was operating on autopilot while their mind dealt with trauma. "Let me help you get back to your car," I said, raising my flashlight to get a better look at him. The beam hit his face, and his eyes lit up like two yellow reflectors on a midnight highway. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. When I opened my eyes again, the man was gone, completely gone. I swept the flashlight beam back and forth across the entire area where he'd been standing. Nothing. No movement. No sound. No sign anyone had been there at all. I walked to the exact spot where I'd seen him, looking for footprints in the dirt around the gate. The ground was undisturbed. No shoe prints, no scuff marks, nothing to show a person had been standing there moments before. The silence that followed felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. Not just quiet, totally empty. No insects, no wind through the trees, no distant animal sounds. It was like someone had put the entire forest on mute. I grabbed the gate chain with hands that wouldn't stop shaking and worked the padlock closed as fast as possible. The click of the lock sounded unnaturally loud in the dead air. I tested it twice, making sure it was secure, then backed away from the entrance without turning around. The walk back to the station felt like it took forever. I kept the flashlight moving, checking the trees on both sides of the path, but saw nothing except dark trunks and empty shadows. I found myself holding my breath without meaning to. Inside the station, I locked the door and checked it twice before setting my flashlight on the desk. My hands were still shaking as I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, even though the last thing I needed was more caffeine. I tried to go back to the paperwork, but the numbers swam in front of my eyes. Every few minutes I'd look up at the windows, half expecting to see that man's face pressed against the glass. The rational part of my brain kept trying to come up with explanations. Maybe he'd been a lost hiker who wandered off while I was distracted by the flashlight beam. Maybe the eye reflection was just a trick of the light. But I knew what I'd seen. Those yellow eyes weren't human, and people don't just vanish into thin air without leaving a trace. I spent the rest of the night jumping at every small sound, checking the locks on the door every hour, and avoiding the windows entirely. When dawn finally started to creep through the trees, I felt like I'd aged about 10 years in one night. The first thing I did after the sun came up was walk back to the gate area with my coffee mug in hand, telling myself I needed to do a thorough inspection. I spent 20 minutes examining every inch of ground around the entrance, looking for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. The dirt showed only my own boot prints from the night before. I stood there sipping my coffee and trying to make sense of what had happened. The logical explanations all fell apart when I remembered those eyes and the way the man had moved like his body was being controlled by someone who'd never used one before. Robert would be back in a few hours for the morning shift change. I could tell him about the incident, but what would I say? That I'd seen a man who disappeared into thin air and left no footprints? That his eyes glowed yellow like an animal's? He'd probably think I was having some kind of breakdown from the stress of starting a new job in an isolated location. Or worse, he might think I was the type of ranger who saw things that weren't there and couldn't handle the responsibilities. I decided to keep the incident to myself, at least for now. But as I walked back to the station, I made a mental promise that would stick with me for the rest of my time at Yellowstone. I would never, ever forget to close that gate before sunset again. Whatever was out there in the woods after dark, I didn't want to meet it twice. The week that followed my gate incident had gotten into a routine that felt almost normal. I'd gotten better at managing the paperwork load, and my coffee had stayed hot through most of my evening work hours. Robert seemed happy with my performance during our brief morning handoffs, though he never asked about anything unusual happening during the night hours. I'd made peace with the paperwork side of things, finding a rhythm that let me complete inventory reports and maintenance logs without the overwhelming feeling that had taken over me during those first few days. The quiet of the station after dark had become familiar rather than bothering me, and I'd stopped jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. That changed during my work hours the following Tuesday. I was updating trail condition reports when the first scream cut through the night air. The sound came from somewhere deep in the forest, raw and desperate, the kind of cry that hits you in the chest and demands immediate action. "Help!" The voice carried clearly through the darkness, high-pitched and frantic. "Please, someone help me!" My pen froze halfway through writing, "Trail marker needs replacement." The voice was distinctly human, and whoever was out there sounded terrified beyond reason. Every fiber of my being wanted to grab my flashlight and radio and run toward that sound. Instead, I forced myself to set the pen down carefully and pulled the rule list from my shirt pocket. Rule number 3 stared back at me. If you hear voices calling for help at night, do not investigate. "Help me! I'm lost. I can't find the path." The voice was closer now, maybe a few hundred yards from the station. It belonged to a woman, and she sounded like she was crying between her calls for help. I gripped the edge of the desk hard enough to make my knuckles ache. I stood up and walked to the window, though I kept well back from the glass. The forest beyond looked exactly the same as always. Dark tree trunks disappearing into deeper shadows, no movement, no sign of distress. But the voice continued, growing more desperate with each plea. "Please, anyone, I'm hurt and I can't see." The logical part of my brain screamed that someone was really in trouble out there, someone who needed help, who might die if I didn't act. But Robert's warning repeated just as loudly. Previous rangers who interpreted the rules creatively didn't work out. I went back to my desk and picked up the radio, checking that it was tuned to the emergency frequency. If this was a real person in real trouble, other rangers would hear the calls too. Someone with more experience would respond appropriately. The radio stayed silent except for the usual static. "Help! Oh God, please help me! Something's wrong! Something's..." The woman's voice broke into what sounded like real sobs. The sound was heartbreaking, and I found myself standing again without realizing it, my body ready to move toward the door even though my mind knew better. I sat back down and forced myself to focus on the paperwork in front of me, trail conditions, equipment inventory, anything that would keep my hands busy and my mind busy. But the crying continued, sometimes close enough that it seemed to come from right outside the station walls, sometimes farther away as if the person was walking in circles. The panic in the voice never changed, always the same level of fear, the same begging tone, the same broken sobs between words. Hours passed. My coffee grew cold again, and I'd read the same maintenance report at least a dozen times without understanding any of it. The voice kept calling, sometimes screaming, sometimes whispering, but never stopping for more than a few minutes at a time. Around 3 a.m, the forest went completely silent. The change was immediate and complete. One moment the woman's voice was calling out about being lost and hurt, and the next moment there was nothing. No crying, no movement, no sound at all from the darkness beyond the station walls. I sat in that silence for the rest of the night, afraid to move, afraid to do anything that might draw attention to the building. When dawn finally started to come through the trees, I felt like I'd survived something without fully understanding what it was. Jack's truck pulled into the parking lot just after 8, and I'd never been happier to see another human being. He was older than Robert, maybe mid-40s, with a gray beard and the kind of rough face that came from spending a lifetime outdoors. When he walked into the station, his dark eyes immediately found mine. "You look like hell, Patterson. Rough night." I poured myself fresh coffee with hands that still weren't entirely steady. Someone was out in the woods calling for help. Woman sounded like she was lost and hurt. Jack's expression changed instantly. The casual morning greeting disappeared, replaced by something much more serious. He set his gear bag down and looked at my face carefully. "You didn't go out there?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "No. Remembered the rule about voices at night." Jack nodded slowly and some of the tension left his shoulders. "Good. That's good, Patterson." He moved to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup, taking his time with the process. When he turned back to me, his expression was serious. "I've been working this park for 15 years, he said. "Learned the hard way that those voices aren't human, no matter how much they sound like it." "What do you mean, not human?" Jack settled into the chair across from my desk, holding his coffee cup in both hands. "About 8 years ago, we had a ranger named David Chen. Good guy, experienced. Been here for 3 years without any problems. One night he heard a woman crying in the woods, begging for help. Sounded exactly like what you described." He paused to take a sip of coffee, and I could see something dark moving behind his eyes. "David broke protocol, went out there to help her." Jack met my eyes directly. "We found him 3 days later, about 5 miles deep in the backcountry, just sitting on a fallen log, staring at nothing, completely catatonic. Couldn't speak, couldn't respond to questions, couldn't even acknowledge that we were there." My stomach dropped. "What happened to him?" "Transferred to a psychiatric facility in Denver. Last I heard, he still hasn't said a word to anyone." Jack's voice carried a weight that suggested he'd been close to the man. Whatever he saw out there, whatever happened during those 3 days, it broke something in his mind that couldn't be fixed. I thought about the woman's voice from the night before, how genuine the distress had sounded, how every instinct I had was screaming at me to help. but it sounded so real. That's the point. Jack's tone was matter of fact, but his eyes stayed serious. Whatever makes those sounds is excellent at mimicking human distress. Perfect pitch, perfect emotion, perfect desperation. But it's not trying to save anyone, Patterson. It's trying to lure people into the woods. The coffee in my mug had gone cold again, but I took a sip anyway, needing something to do with my hands. Have you heard it before? Twice. First time was about 6 months into my job here. Almost went out to help, but my training officer grabbed me before I could get to the door. Jack leaned back in his chair. Second time was 4 years ago, sounded like a little kid that time, crying for his mom. Broke my heart to sit there and listen, but I knew better by then. The weight of how close I'd come to making David Chen's mistake settled on me like a physical thing. If I hadn't remembered the rule, if I'd trusted my instincts instead of following the protocol, I might be sitting in a psychiatric facility right now, staring at nothing. The rules, I said. They're not really safety guidelines, are they? Jack shook his head. They're survival instructions. Every single one was written because someone learned the hard way what happens when you don't follow them. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest that had looked so beautiful and peaceful just a week ago. This place isn't what it seems, Patterson. There's something out there that doesn't follow the normal rules of how the world works. He turned back to me, and I could see years of experience in the lines around his eyes. But here's the thing. You can work here safely if you respect the boundaries. Follow the rules exactly as written. Never make exceptions. Never think you know better. The protocols exist because people who came before us paid the price for figuring out what works and what doesn't. Jack gathered his gear and headed toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. I'll be around more often now. Help you learn the ropes properly. Robert's good at his job, but he's not much for explaining the why behind things. He met my eyes one more time. You did good last night, Patterson. David Chen was a good ranger too, but he trusted his gut instead of trusting the rules. Don't make that mistake. After he left, I sat alone in the station with my cold coffee and a new understanding of exactly what kind of job I'd signed up for. The forest outside looked exactly the same as it had every other morning, but now I knew it was watching me back. The rule list felt different when I pulled it from my pocket. Not like random regulations, but like a roadmap for survival written by people who'd faced things that couldn't be explained or understood, only endured. I folded the paper carefully and put it back in my shirt pocket, making a mental note to never, ever ignore what was written there. I'd gotten into the habit of checking my shirt pocket before every patrol, making sure the rule list was exactly where it needed to be. 2 weeks into this job, and those 6 lines had become more important to me than my badge or my radio. The voice incident had taught me that much. The evening air carried that crisp mountain scent I was starting to love, mixed with pine needles and the faint smell of distant campfires. My flashlight beams swept back and forth across the main trail as I walked my usual route, checking for damage from the afternoon's tourist traffic. A few scattered candy wrappers, some disturbed rocks where someone had wandered off to take photos. Nothing major. The work itself had become routine in a way that felt good. I knew which trail markers needed tightening, which sections got muddy after rain, where visitors typically got confused about directions. Robert seemed satisfied with my performance during our morning handoffs, and I'd stopped feeling like I was drowning in paperwork every night. But I'd also learned to pay attention to things that didn't belong. That's why I noticed the figure standing about 30 feet off the trail, just past a cluster of dense pine trees. The shape looked human at first glance, right height, right proportions, standing upright like someone who'd stopped to rest. But something about the way it held itself made me pause before calling out. The posture was too rigid, too perfectly still, like a mannequin positioned by someone who'd never seen a person stand naturally. I stopped walking and focused my flashlight in that direction, though I kept the beam low to avoid temporarily blinding whoever was out there. "Sir, ma'am, park's closed for evening hours." The figure didn't respond, but I could see it more clearly now. Definitely human-shaped, wearing what looked like dark clothing. And it was waving. Not frantically, not desperately. Just a slow, deliberate back-and-forth motion with one arm. The kind of wave you'd use to get someone's attention from a distance. Every reasonable instinct told me to step off the trail and see if this person needed help. Maybe they'd gotten turned around, maybe they were injured, maybe they were signaling that someone else needed assistance deeper in the woods. Then I remembered rule number 4. Stay on designated paths, always. The paper crinkled softly as I touched my shirt pocket, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I'd almost stepped off the path without thinking, drawn by what looked like a perfectly normal person asking for help. Instead, I raised my flashlight and aimed the beam directly at the figure. The light hit something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The proportions were human, but the features were all wrong. Where a face should be, there was a smooth expanse of pale skin broken only by 2 yellow eyes that reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's. No nose, no mouth, no expression at all. Just those glowing eyes staring back at me without blinking. The thing didn't move when the light hit it, didn't flinch, didn't turn away, didn't react like any living creature should when suddenly illuminated. It just stood there in that unnaturally rigid posture, continuing its slow, mechanical wave. I backed away along the trail, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure. My hands wanted to shake, but I forced them steady. Whatever that thing was, I wasn't going to lose sight of it or let it know how terrified I was. After about 10 steps backward, the figure simply melted into the darkness between the trees. Not like it walked away or moved behind something. More like it dissolved into the shadows and became part of the forest itself. I stood there for another few minutes, sweeping my flashlight beam across the entire area where it had been standing. Nothing. No movement, no reflection, no sign that anything had ever been there. The walk back to the station took twice as long as usual because I couldn't stop checking over my shoulder. Every tree trunk looked like it might be hiding something. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Back at the station, I made fresh coffee with hands that still weren't entirely steady and tried to focus on my evening reports. But I kept thinking about how close I'd come to leaving the trail, how natural it had seemed to want to help someone who appeared to be signaling for assistance. 3 days later, I was working late on a stack of trail condition reports when an intense blue light appeared deep in the forest. At first, I thought it might be headlights from a vehicle that had somehow gotten lost on one of the back roads. But the light was wrong. Too blue, too bright, and coming from an area where no roads existed. It pulsed with a steady rhythm, like a massive heartbeat made of electricity. I set down my pen and walked to the window, keeping well back from the glass. The light was definitely coming from somewhere in the woods, maybe half a mile from the station. As I watched, it grew brighter, casting strange blue shadows through the tree line that moved in patterns that didn't match any natural light source. Rule number 5 came back to me immediately. Avoid any lights seen in the forest. I grabbed the cord for the window blinds and pulled them closed, then moved quickly through the station, doing the same for every other window. The main door already had its usual locks engaged, but I checked them twice and threw the deadbolt for good measure. Even with all the blinds closed, the blue light was bright enough to leak through the gaps around the edges. The pulsing rhythm seemed to speed up, and I could swear I felt vibrations through the floor, like someone was operating heavy machinery in the middle of the wilderness. I returned to my desk and tried to concentrate on paperwork, but the light was impossible to ignore. It painted everything inside the station with an eerie blue glow that flashed in time with the pulsing. The shadows it created didn't behave the way shadows should. They moved independently, stretching and contracting without any apparent connection to the objects that cast them. The light continued for over an hour. Sometimes it dimmed to barely visible. Sometimes it flared so bright that I could see every detail of the station interior through the closed blinds. The vibrations never stopped, creating a low, buzzing sound that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The transition was immediate and complete. One moment the station was filled with that unnatural blue glow, and the next moment, it was just the normal fluorescent lighting and the quiet buzz of the coffee maker. The vibrations stopped, the shadows returned to normal, and the forest outside became completely silent. I sat at my desk for the rest of the night, afraid to open the blinds, afraid to look outside, afraid of what I might see if that light came back. When dawn finally started to creep through the gaps around the window coverings, I felt like I'd survived something that shouldn't exist. The first thing I did after sunrise was walk outside with my coffee mug and listen to the forest. Complete silence. No birds singing their morning songs, no insects buzzing, no squirrels chattering in the trees. It was like someone had evacuated every living thing from the entire area. Jack arrived for his change of duty about an hour later, and the relief I felt at seeing his truck was overwhelming. When he walked into the station, he took one look at my face and poured himself coffee without saying anything. "Blue light," I said. "Last night. Lasted about an hour." Jack nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Deep in the woods?" "Yeah, maybe half a mile out. Pulsing, really bright." I gestured toward the windows. Had to close all the blinds and lock everything up. "Good," Jack said. "That's exactly what you're supposed to do." He settled into the chair across from my desk, holding his coffee cup with both hands. His expression was serious but not surprised, like I'd just reported a routine maintenance issue. "I've seen that light 4 times in 15 years, he said. "Never found out what causes it, and I don't want to. 2 rangers tried to investigate it back in the early 2000s. Both ended up transferred to different parks after spending weeks in psychiatric evaluation." I thought about the vibrations I'd felt through the floor, the way the shadows had moved independently of their sources. What happened to them? Same thing that happened to David Chen, more or less. Couldn't speak coherently about what they'd seen. Couldn't function normally afterward. Jack took a sip of coffee and stared out the window at the silent forest. One of them kept drawing the same symbol over and over again, a complex geometric pattern that didn't match anything anyone had ever seen before. The other one would just rock back and forth and repeat coordinates that didn't correspond to any known location. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. "The forest is completely quiet this morning. No birds, no animals. They'll come back," Jack said. "Usually takes about 3 days after a blue light event. Animals are smarter than people when it comes to knowing what should be avoided." He stood up and walked to the window, opening the blinds to look out at the tree line. "You did everything right, Patterson. Followed the rules exactly as written, didn't try to investigate or get a better look. That's why you're sitting here drinking coffee instead of drawing patterns on the walls of a mental health facility." Jack turned back to me, and I could see something that might have been pride in his worn face. "Robert doesn't explain much about why the rules exist, but I think you're starting to figure it out on your own. This place isn't normal. There are things in these woods that don't follow the laws of nature as we understand them. But they do follow patterns, and people smarter than us have figured out how to coexist with them safely." He gathered his gear and headed toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "The rules work, Patterson. They've kept me alive for 15 years, and they'll keep you alive too if you trust them completely. Don't ever think you know better, don't ever make exceptions, and don't ever assume that something looks harmless just because it appears familiar." After he left, I sat alone in the station with my cold coffee and a growing understanding of exactly what kind of guardian I'd become. The forest outside looked peaceful and inviting in the morning sunlight, but I knew now that appearances meant nothing in this place. I pulled the rule list from my shirt pocket and read through it again, seeing each line in a new light. These weren't random restrictions put in place by bureaucrats who'd never worked in the field. They were survival instructions written in the blood and madness of rangers who'd learned too late what happened when you trusted your instincts instead of following protocol. 2 weeks into this job, and I was finally beginning to understand what I'd signed up for. By my 4th week, the maintenance routines had become second nature. I could replace damaged trail markers with my eyes closed, knew exactly which tools worked best for clearing fallen branches, and had developed an efficient system for checking equipment conditions around the visitor center. The morning air carried that familiar pine scent I'd grown to love, and my hands moved automatically through the tasks while my mind stayed alert for anything unusual. I was tightening the bolts on a picnic table near the visitor center when I heard it. A child crying. The sound drifted through the trees from somewhere beyond the designated trail area, raw and heartbroken in a way that made my chest tighten. It was the kind of crying that meant real distress, not the frustrated wailing of a tired kid, but the desperate sobs of someone who was lost and scared and alone. My wrench froze halfway through its rotation. Every part of me wanted to drop my tools and run toward that sound. The crying had a quality that cut straight through rational thought and went directly to whatever part of the human brain was hardwired to protect children. "Mommy." The voice was high and thin, maybe belonging to a kid around 5 or 6 years old. "Mommy, where are you? I can't find you." I stood up from the picnic table and looked toward the tree line where the crying seemed to come from. Nothing visible through the thick pine branches, but the sound continued with an intensity that made my hands clench into fists. This wasn't some distant sound or trick of acoustics. This was a child in immediate distress, and I was standing here doing nothing about it. The rule list crinkled as I pressed my hand against my shirt pocket. Rule number 6. Do not investigate crying sounds, especially children. Especially children. The specificity of that phrase had always bothered me, but now it felt like a chain wrapped around my legs, holding me in place when every instinct told me to move. "Help me, I'm scared. Please help me." The voice was closer now, maybe 50 yards into the woods, still within the tree line, still technically off the designated path, but close enough that I could probably reach the source in less than 5 minutes. Close enough that a flashlight beam might show a small figure sitting against a tree trunk, confused and scared. I picked up my wrench and forced myself to return to the picnic table. The bolts needed tightening. That was my job. That was what I was supposed to be doing right now. But the crying continued, and it was tearing me apart. "Daddy! Daddy, I can't see you. It's dark and I'm scared." My hands started shaking, making it impossible to work the wrench properly. The voice was moving now, traveling along the tree line parallel to the visitor center. Not random movement, deliberate, like someone was walking through the woods while crying, like a lost child was wandering deeper into the forest with every passing moment. I set the wrench down and walked closer to the edge of the designated area, stopping just short of the tree line. If I could see anything from here, maybe I could call for backup, radio for a proper search team with the right equipment and training. "Please, someone please help me. I want to go home." The desperation in that voice was genuine. No kid was that good an actor. No adult could fake that level of innocent terror. Whatever was out there, it was a real child who needed immediate help. My foot lifted to take the first step off the path. Then I stopped, remembering David Chen sitting catatonic on a log, staring at nothing. Remembering the 2 rangers who'd checked out the blue light and ended up drawing patterns on psychiatric ward walls. Remembering Jack's warning about trusting the rules completely, no matter what. I backed away from the tree line and returned to the picnic table, picking up my wrench. The crying continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always moving. Always just out of sight. 20 minutes passed, then 25. The voice never stopped calling for help, never grew hoarse, never showed any sign that a real child would show after crying that intensely for that long. By the 30-minute mark, I was sitting on the ground next to my tool bag, gripping the wrench so tightly that my knuckles had gone white. Then Jack's truck pulled into the visitor center parking lot, and I felt something inside my chest relax. He walked over carrying his radio and gear bag, but stopped when he saw my face. The crying had moved farther into the woods by then, still audible, but more distant. "You okay, Patterson? There's a kid out there." I gestured toward the tree line with the wrench. "Been crying for help for half an hour. Sounds young, maybe 5 or 6. Jack's expression changed immediately. He set his gear bag down and listened for a moment, his weathered face growing grim as the distant crying reached us through the trees. "You didn't go after it?" "No." Remembered Rule 6. Jack nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Good. That's good." He moved to his truck and pulled out a pair of binoculars, looking around the tree line methodically. After a few minutes, he lowered them and shook his head. "Nothing visible, no movement, no sign of distress. But you can hear it, right? The crying?" "I can hear it." Jack put the binoculars away and walked back to where I was sitting. "That exact sound has lured away 2 rangers in the past decade." My stomach dropped. "What happened to them?" Jack sat down on the picnic table I'd been working on, his boots resting on the bench. "First one was about 7 years ago. Ranger named Sarah Walsh, been here for 4 years without any problems. Heard a child crying during an afternoon patrol just like you did. Broke protocol and went into the woods to help." He paused, listening to the distant crying that continued to drift through the trees. "We found her 3 days later, about 8 miles deep in the backcountry. Just sitting by a stream, completely unresponsive. Couldn't tell us what had happened, couldn't remember her own name, couldn't function as a human being anymore." "And the second one?" "Marcus Rivera, 2 years ago. Same story, child crying for help, he couldn't ignore it." Jack's voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched colleagues disappear into something they couldn't understand. "Found him 5 days later in a different area. Same condition. Both of them ended up in long-term psychiatric care." The crying was growing fainter now, moving deeper into the forest. Soon it would fade completely, leaving behind only the normal sounds of wind through pine needles and distant bird calls. "But we never found any lost children during either incident," Jack continued. "Search teams covered hundreds of square miles, checked every camping area and trail for weeks afterward. No missing persons reports, no worried parents, no evidence that any kids had even been in the park." I thought about how genuine the distress had sounded, how every parental instinct I had was screaming to help that child. It was so convincing. "That's what makes it dangerous." Jack stood up and shouldered his gear bag. "Whatever produces that sound has had a long time to perfect it. Knows exactly what will trigger human protective instincts. Knows how to make grown adults abandon their training and common sense." The forest had gone completely quiet now. No more crying, no more pleas for help. Just the normal mountain silence that I'd learned to appreciate during my weeks here. "You did exactly the right thing, Patterson," Jack said. "Followed the rule even when every fiber of your being was telling you to break it. That's what kept you safe today." He headed toward his truck, then turned back to me. "The rules aren't arbitrary, and they're not suggestions. They were written by people who learned the hard way what happens when you trust your instincts instead of trusting the protocol. Every single rule exists because someone like Sarah or Marcus or David paid the price for us to understand what works and what doesn't." After he drove away, I sat alone with my tools and tried to process what had just happened. The picnic table still needed work, but my hands weren't steady enough to hold the wrench properly. Instead, I pulled the rule list from my shirt pocket and read through it again. Each line wasn't just a guideline. It was a lesson written in the blood and madness of rangers who'd come before me. People who'd faced something in these woods that couldn't be explained or understood, only survived through strict following of protocols that had been developed through tragic experience. I folded the paper carefully and returned it to my pocket, then picked up my wrench and went back to work. The forest around me looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. But I understood now that appearances meant nothing in this place. The rules were all that stood between me and whatever had broken Sarah Walsh and Marcus Rivera and David Chen, and I was going to follow them exactly as written no matter what I heard crying in the woods. 2 months of following the rules had turned me into something like a competent ranger. The muscle memory was there now, checking my shirt pocket for the rule list before every patrol, closing the gate exactly at sunset without fail, staying on designated paths without even thinking about alternatives. My hands no longer shook when I heard voices in the woods at night. And I'd learned to recognize the subtle signs that came before the strange events. The way birds went quiet before something appeared, how the air temperature seemed to drop just before lights appeared in the forest. The job had become routine in ways I never expected. Morning equipment checks, afternoon trail maintenance, evening paperwork, night vigilance. But beneath that routine lay a constant awareness that one mistake, one moment of curiosity or compassion overriding protocol could end with me sitting catatonic in a psychiatric ward somewhere. I'd stopped questioning why the rules existed. After witnessing the faceless figure by the trail, the blue light that made shadows move independently, and the child's voice that had nearly broken my resolve, I understood that some knowledge came at too high a price. The rules worked, and that was enough. Robert's radio crackled to life while I was updating trail condition reports at my desk. His voice carried its usual measured tone, but something about the timing felt different. Morning handoffs were routine, brief exchanges of information before he headed out for his shift. This call came 3 hours later when he should have been deep into his patrol route. "Patterson, need you back at the main station. Got some paperwork to review with you." I acknowledged the transmission and gathered my gear, wondering what administrative issue needed immediate attention. My reports had been thorough and submitted on time. Equipment logs were current, and I hadn't encountered any incidents during the past week that would warrant additional documentation. The drive back to the station took 15 minutes along the winding park roads. Robert's truck was already in the parking area, which meant he'd cut his patrol short specifically for this meeting. That realization made my stomach tighten with worry. In 2 months, Robert had never changed from established schedules unless something serious was happening. I found him in his office, sitting behind his metal desk with a manila folder open in front of him. The same sparse room where he'd first handed me the rule list, though it felt different now. Less intimidating. More like a command center where serious decisions were made by people who understood what they meant. "Close the door and have a seat," Robert said without looking up from whatever documents he was reviewing. I settled into the chair across from his desk, the same one where I'd first heard about never entering the woods after dark. The framed photos of past rangers seemed to watch me from their positions on the wall, faces of men and women who'd served in this place and understood what that service meant. Robert closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, studying me with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. His weathered hands folded on the desk surface, and I could see the calluses and scars that came from decades of outdoor work. "Been reviewing your performance over the past 2 months," he said. "Daily reports, equipment maintenance, adherence to protocols, overall job performance." My chest tightened. Performance reviews weren't supposed to happen until the 6-month mark according to the employment materials I'd gotten. Early reviews usually meant problems, and problems in this job carried consequences I didn't want to think about. "Wanted to discuss your probationary status," Robert continued. "Park Service has specific requirements for new rangers working in this area, different standards than most assignments." He opened the folder again and pulled out several sheets of paper covered with his careful handwriting. Notes, observations, evaluations dating back to my first week on the job. "Most new rangers don't make it past the first month," Robert said. "They either quit after their first encounter with something they can't explain, or they break protocol trying to be heroes and end up transferred to psychiatric facilities." The weight of that statement settled over me like cold mountain air, I thought about David Chen, Sarah Walsh, Marcus Rivera, and the unnamed rangers who'd investigated lights or tried to rescue voices calling from the darkness. You've had multiple encounters with anomalous phenomena during your time here, Robert continued, consulting his notes. Faceless figure on October 15th, blue light event on October 22nd, auditory manifestation on November 3rd. Each time, you followed established protocols exactly as written. He set the papers aside and met my eyes directly. You're the first new ranger in 5 years to complete the probationary period without quitting or requiring medical intervention. Relief hit me so hard that I had to grab the chair arms to keep steady. I'd passed. Whatever test this job was, I'd managed to survive it, too. Jack's been providing informal training and evaluation, Robert said. Reports that you've internalized the importance of rule adherence and demonstrated consistent sound judgment under pressure. Robert pulled another document from the folder, this one bearing official Park Service letterhead and several signature lines. Which brings me to why I called you in today. Park Service is offering you a permanent position, pending your acceptance of additional responsibilities and acknowledgement of certain realities about this assignment. The permanent position was everything I'd hoped for when I first applied to work at Yellowstone. Job security, full benefits, the chance to build a career in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. But Robert's expression suggested there were conditions attached that went beyond standard employment terms. What kind of additional responsibilities? Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. The Park Service knows about the anomalies, Patterson. Has known for decades. Can't explain them, can't stop them. Can't make them public knowledge without causing widespread panic and destroying the tourism industry that supports half the local economy. The admission hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Official acknowledgement that everything I'd witnessed was real, documented, and accepted by people far above Robert's pay grade. What we can do is manage the situation through careful protocol development and strategic personnel placement. Those rules you've been following weren't created by rangers in the field. They represent decades of trial and error, investigation and loss, refinement through tragedy. Robert pulled out a thick binder I'd never seen before, bound in government-issue blue covers with classification markings I couldn't read from across the desk. Every rule exists because someone learned through terrible experience what happens when it's ignored. We've lost 17 rangers over the past 30 years to various phenomena. Another 12 ended up in long-term psychiatric care. The rules represent everything we've learned about coexistence with forces we don't understand. The scope of what he was describing made my head spin. 17 dead rangers, 12 others broken beyond repair, all of it hidden from public knowledge, managed through bureaucratic channels and careful personnel selection. Your job, if you accept the permanent position, is to continue that tradition of protective service. Keep visitors safe from threats they'll never know existed. Follow protocols that preserve your sanity and your life. Train the next new ranger when the time comes. Robert slid the employment documents across the desk toward me. This isn't a job for everyone, Patterson. Means living with constant vigilance, accepting that there are things in this world that can't be understood or controlled, only survived through strict adherence to procedures developed through other people's sacrifice. I looked down at the papers, seeing my name typed on signature lines next to paragraphs of legal language about discretion agreements and special assignment conditions. Everything I'd experienced over the past 2 months had led to this moment. The choice between a comfortable, normal life and something that defied every rational expectation I'd brought to this place. The pay grade is higher than standard ranger positions, Robert continued. Hazard compensation and additional benefits to account for the unique nature of the work. But the real question is whether you can handle what this job really means. I thought about the faceless figure waving from the tree line, the blue light that made shadows move independently of their sources, the child's voice that had nearly broken my resolve to follow protocol. Each encounter had taught me something about the limits of human understanding and the importance of accepting those limits. "I'll take it," I said without hesitation. Robert nodded as if my answer had been predetermined by everything that had happened during the past 8 weeks. "Good. Jack thought you would, but we had to make it official." I signed the documents with hands that stayed steady the whole time. Each signature felt like a commitment not just to employment, but to joining something bigger than myself. A tradition of protection that kept innocent people safe from knowledge that would destroy them. Robert collected the papers and filed them in his desk drawer, then stood up and extended his hand for a firm handshake. "Welcome to permanent assignment, Patterson. Jack will continue providing additional training on advanced protocols and situations you haven't encountered yet. There's more to learn, but you've proven you have the temperament for this work." The drive back to my evening station assignment felt different somehow. The forest looked the same, the trails followed their usual routes, the mountains rose in the same tall shapes I'd grown to love, but I was seeing it all through the eyes of someone who'd taken on the job of protecting others from threats they couldn't imagine. That evening, I sat at my desk with the rule list spread in front of me and a pen in my hand. 2 months of experience had taught me things that weren't written in those original 6 lines. Details about timing, warning signs, small changes in what happened that could mean the difference between safety and disaster. I opened a notebook and began writing additional notes, creating guidance for whoever would sit in this chair next. Someone young and eager like I'd been. Someone who would need help beyond the basic rules to survive their first encounters with the impossible. "Additional notes for new rangers," I wrote at the top of the page, based on field experience, October-December. Below that, I added observations about the complete silence that came before strange events, the way animals left areas hours before weird things showed up, the importance of checking locks twice and avoiding windows during blue light events. Small details that could save someone's life or sanity. The work felt important in a way that went beyond normal job duties. I was adding my voice to a tradition of protective knowledge, contributing to protocols that would keep future rangers safe from discoveries that had broken better people than me. By midnight, I'd filled 4 pages with detailed notes and recommendations. Everything from best flashlight positioning during night patrols to recognition patterns for telling real emergencies from supernatural lures. Knowledge gained through terror and determination, refined through survival and careful observation. I folded the original rule list and returned it to my shirt pocket where it belonged, then filed my additional notes in the desk drawer where the next new ranger would find them. Someone would sit in this chair eventually, face the same choices I'd faced, make the same decision to follow protocol instead of trusting instincts. The forest outside stayed quiet and peaceful under the star-filled mountain sky. Visitors slept safely in campgrounds and hotels, protected by rules they'd never know existed, watched over by people they'd never meet. It was exactly the kind of work I'd hoped to find when I first applied to the Park Service, though nothing like what I'd expected. I poured fresh coffee and settled back at my desk with the evening reports, listening to the sounds of the old station building and feeling proud to be part of something larger than myself. The rules would keep me safe, just as they'd keep safe whoever came after me. And through that careful following of protocol, we'd continue the tradition of silent guardianship that had protected innocent people for decades.